Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Prime and Load. My name is Lee Gugino, and as always, we're joined by our doctors, Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. And today, we're very lucky to be joined by Dr. Sam Cavell. And we're going to be talking about a subject that I've nerded out a few times on the show about. We're going to be talking about naval warfare, and this is going to be kind of a primer to naval warfare in the 18th century. So, Sam, thank you very much for joining us. Can you just give us a little bit of background about yourself, where you are, what you're doing?
Sure. I teach military history at Southeastern Louisiana University, which is just outside of New Orleans. And I'm also an adjunct for the U.S. Naval War College. I get to talk about military history and specifically naval history a lot. My degree was in naval history and maritime history, so that's my first love. But I do have to broaden the discussion for my students a little bit. But naval history becomes a big part of my military history classes for undergrads and graduate students, which I don't know if it was in the past. So yeah, you've got to get it in there because it's an incredibly important piece of the military history story.
Awesome. And like I said, I'm absolutely nerding out about this. I love naval history. It's so much fun. And I think we were saying before, all of your Army buddies will give you weird looks when you talk about naval stuff, but we're leaning into it this time. So we're very excited to have you.
Love it. Thank you.
If you could kick things off for us then, Sam, as an introduction, just in the simplest terms, could you give us an outline explanation of just how important naval power, naval dominance was in 18th century warfare? Presumably very in your case.
Yeah, it is varied. But I mean, the importance of naval power is critical because naval power is the thing that allows you to project power. Right? You can have an army in a continental situation, and that's going to be great for you if you want to deal with contiguous land powers, right? That'll deal with that. But if you're going to project power, if you're going to maintain colonies, if you're going to grow economically as a nation, you need that naval power. And it's that, we call it the virtuous circle, right? Of economic growth through the development of overseas trade. But that economic growth and that overseas trade has to be protected. So that's why you have a navy. And then the navy sort of creates this nice environment where all of that trade can flourish. And in turn, the trade feeds back all of this wonderful tax revenue to the government, which can then reinvest in the navy. So it becomes this self-fulfilling cycle of power and money and power projection. And so as you're going, and this is what of course enables Britain to grow, and this is Alfred Thayer Mahan's theory about why Britain was able to go from being, this tiny, isolated, damp, foggy island to being the empire on which the sun never sets. So it's kind of the explanation of imperial power in the 18th and 19th century. And many try to replicate it. That's something that really, in many ways, drives the conflicts of the early 20th century as well. This understanding of just how important that becomes. But I think they understood it back then too. I mean, the need to have colonies, the need to be able to grab all those resources coming out of a mercantilist, early modern state. That's great, but you've got to get those materials back and you've got to protect the trade between those colonial regions and the home country. And you need a navy to do that.
Okay, so I mean that's the theory, if you like. I mean, I've looked to an extent myself, looking at amphibious expeditions, sort of into the mechanics of projecting naval power. I've done that mostly from an army point of view. The one thing that does come to mind is there may be differences if you're mounting an expedition in European waters or if you're going across the Atlantic or further afield. But thinking particularly from the naval perspective, could you take us through the mechanics of how a fleet operation like that might actually work in the context of 18th century warfare?
Yeah, I mean, mounting an expeditionary warfare situation is incredibly complicated, right? I mean, you've got so many moving parts that need to be organized, and transportation is the key thing. So there has to be enough usually merchant ships that can be co-opted for naval service, rented by the Navy, paid for by the Navy, to be able to act as transports to get that military force to another continent or wherever it needs to go. And that's something, quite frankly, that Britain is learning how to do that over an extended period of time. They start doing it in the early 18th century, but even by the time we're talking about the American Revolutionary War, this is on a scale that's unprecedented. Revolutionary War sees expeditionary warfare in Britain going to this new level, and obviously they're making huge mistakes as they try to do this, because it is so complicated. There are so many logistical moving parts here. And although I do think that we could probably safely say that the Revolutionary War experience for Britain sets them up for success in the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, because by then there is a very good understanding of how to do it. There may not always be the resources to do it, but they know what they need. So I think it's this really long learning curve of how to put together not just the transports, but all of the victualling, the water supplies, the needs for ammunition, the needs for command ships, the needs for landing craft. We don't think about that, but if you're going to engage in expeditionary warfare, you need landing craft and small boats, which are always a problem for the Royal Navy. Always a problem. I mean, even going right through the Napoleonic Wars, it's a problem. So, they are just becoming more and more aware of the issues, and they're understanding what they need. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have it, or that they have really solved all of those resourcing problems by the time we get to the early 19th century. But they're on a long curve.
I'm just curious. I mean, I've looked more at the earlier part of the century, and I mean, my feeling, maybe you disagree with this based on what you said, but my ignorant landlubber feeling was that Britain had got it quite sus by the end of the 7 Years' War, thinking of Havana and Manila and so on. But you were mentioning mistakes even into the American War. Could you expand on that a little bit? Because that's certainly challenging what I understood to be the orthodoxy, and I'm intrigued to know why I'm wrong.
No, I don't think you're wrong. I mean, they are doing better, but I think the difference by the time we get to the American Revolution is scale. It's unprecedented in the scale of the numbers of men that are being moved across the Atlantic, and of course, it's such vast distances that have to be covered. So now you are compounding all of those resourcing issues of how do we get the food, how do we get the landing craft, how do we get the watering, the ammunition, how do we get all of that stuff? Uniforms, replacement uniforms, boots. How do we get those things to the men who need it? And I just don't think there is a very clear understanding of exactly what that's going to take, even at the start of the American Revolution. And then you also have political problems with that, right? I mean, you've got the actual material, resourcing, military and naval logistical issues. But you also have all of the political nightmare, quite frankly, that is going on alongside of that back in Parliament. And that is putting roadblocks in many ways in front of the Navy and even the Army's ability to do these things. There's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of discord, a lot of political factionalism that is really cutting down on Britain's ability to respond in probably the way that they should have responded, in a more holistic way.
So I'd like to, if I can, we were talking a lot about expeditionary warfare. For those listeners who may not know what that is, I have a modern kind of definition of what that might mean, but can you explain to us, if it's possible, give that expeditionary warfare a definition and how it might differ from any of the operations, the land operations we've talked about on the show?
Okay, so expeditionary warfare means you are taking soldiers, you're taking an army, you're putting them on ships, and you're transporting them across an ocean, or across a sea lane or to a distant shore. And I mean, the problems are obvious, right? They are legion with this, not just between inter-service rivalry, but just the nightmare of trying to deal with this. And it's a really difficult thing. And then you have the problems of physically landing all of those men. And in fact, when we think about a lot of the big problems that have come up, even in the French Revolutionary period, the problems of landing soldiers on distant shores create all sorts of issues going into 1799, 1800. I mean, there are disasters that befall the Army-Navy combined operations at Quiberon Bay in that era. And they're so bad that the landing that's attempted at Belle-Île is such a disaster that it almost ends the careers of multiple officers, both Army and Navy. It's a mess. And so when they're going in to, say, land in Egypt in 1801, it's like, guys, we have to get this right. And by then, the disasters that have been learned, on the French coast, trying to come down into the Mediterranean and land in Egypt in 1801, those are going to be put into practice. It's like, okay, we've got to get this straight. We have to get everyone organized. We have to get everyone ready to go together. And that is just a logistical nightmare when you've not really done this before. I mean, it's so hard, and especially if you're landing in an opposed situation. In that particular landing in Egypt in 1801 at Aboukir Bay on the Bay of Alexandria, though it was entrenched artillery positions on the shore. So they are being fired at the whole time. So that also adds into the factor, is this an opposed landing or not? All of those factors have to be brought into this. If things go really south, can you get these men off? Can you get them off the beaches? Or are you going to lose an entire landing force if things don't go exactly according to plan? Expeditionary warfare is really a fraught and treacherous thing. And the other thing to add about it is that you can only engage in expeditionary warfare if you have a secure homeland, right? You have to be very, very secure in the defense of your home nation in order to engage in expeditionary warfare, because you're taking a whole lot of your military resources away from home. So that's why England is particularly well placed in the 18th and 19th century to do this, because it's an island. It can secure itself.
So if we're way off track of where we should be, but that's maybe the point. If I could ask a follow-up question here. So when I think about naval warfare, I always try to do so with the phrase of a French soldier from the War of Independence in my mind, Baron Ludwig von Clausen. He's a German speaker, obviously, but in the French army. And he's on a transport on his way to America in 1780. And the convoy that he's in is getting ready to come under attack by the Royal Navy. And he writes, on board the transport, we had nothing better to do than to judge the maneuvers and make some deductions, in truth, like blind men who like to talk about colors. Naval warfare is completely alien to me, I think, in many ways. A theme that we've touched on a little bit in land warfare in the podcast is how because institutions aren't maintained in peacetime in some military environments, you kind of have to learn on the job in warfare in terms of landing craft, in terms of in conducting amphibious warfare. Do you see almost like an arc that the British Navy is getting better at doing this as the wars are going on, and then it falls off in peacetime, and you're sort of improving again as you enter into the next war? Or are these institutions that are maintained in peacetime, and a lot of the institutional knowledge is not lost?
No, I think you're absolutely right, Alex. The British have this self-defeating habit of every time we go into a peace, we demobilize massively, right? Let everyone go home. put the ships in mothballs and call it a day. And even though there is, I think, an implicit understanding, of course, that they are a naval power and that is their principal military tool for defense and offense, or an offensive defense, if you will, then, they still, out of monetary necessity, usually have to demobilize. So it's almost, it may not necessarily have been planned that way, that, we're just going to let all of that institutional knowledge go by the wayside, but that's effectively what happens. What's I guess, relatively lucky about the onset of the French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleonic Wars, when they happen, is that you still have a relatively good number of people who are young enough as officers who are leftovers from the American Revolutionary War, that can then come online, come on board, and launch Britain from a level of, a much higher level of initial understanding than probably what they had at the start of the American Revolutionary War. Because again, even though they'd landed a few soldiers in the 7 Years' War, my goodness, I mean, they are not ready. They are not ready for what they have to do come 1775.
And that's a great point. And if I'm getting the kind of the math and the dates right in my mind, I mean, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War doesn't end until 84, I think. So there's only a 5-year span until the revolution begins, and an 8-year span until the next war kicks off. So that's not a huge kind of gap of time. I mean, by comparison, what the 7 Years' War ends in 63, and fighting doesn't begin until 75. It's 12 years, so it's a bit longer. Sorry, I'll stop with follow-ups now.
No.
I do wonder, actually, if I can continue the follow-up, though, Alex, whether you've actually got a similar issue there, because the thing that struck me is that you've got people in the 1740s learning how not to do it, and then putting it right in the 7 Years' War, and then you've got a generational shift to the people Sam's talking about who have to learn it all again. I take the point entirely about the bigger scale, and yes, obviously you go from the 1750s, where the British war effort in North America is being supported by the North Americans, or the British European colonies, to a situation where they are the enemy, which obviously removes all that support and shifts it onto the other side of the ledger. Just at the same time, as you say, you need to bring a much bigger army into play as well. So moving on from that point and vaguely trying to get back onto the script, obviously one change then is that the Americans are on the other side in this war. But I mean, who else are the major maritime powers? Because it seems to me this is the other issue. Alex has already mentioned the Anglo-Dutch conflict that flares up again. But Britain has pretty much picked a fight with most of the maritime world by the end of the war. So who else is in the running, and how do they stack up?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that picking a fight with the rest of the maritime world is an unintentional outcome of this. There is a real effort at appeasement against other maritime powers, the biggest ones, of course, being France and Spain. The Dutch are in there as well, but I think the North administration, the North government, is very much of a mind that we do not want to provoke the Spanish and we do not want to provoke the French, while we are dealing with what they see is, of course, an internecine issue in North America. These are not Americans. These are British people who are misbehaving, who need to be brought back into line. And I think this is the entire problem with the whole American Revolutionary War story, is that this is a political problem that should have had a political answer and a political solution. But that's very difficult to do when you have riots and rebellion and you have a lot of violence going on in Boston. I mean, Boston clearly is the big problem here. So it negates the right. Boston's always a problem. Sorry, Boston. Love y'all, but yeah, y'all are always an issue. But trying to kind of get that under control politically is incredibly difficult. from all of the distance and everything that's come before in the 7 Years' War as well. But I don't think they wanted to provoke the other maritime powers. Now, Britain knew, obviously, alone, that it was the largest maritime force on the planet. Okay, it had maritime hegemony in terms of its ability to wield a navy that was larger than anyone else's. But when you combine the French and the Spanish together, that is not the case. And that is a really big concern, especially for Lord Sandwich, who is First Lord of the Admiralty under the North Ministry. And he is very, very concerned. And I think this is why we have this kind of strategic dilemma going on within the government at the start of the American Revolutionary War, because yes, we have to deal with this problem over in North America, but we have the potential for an enormous problem on our own shores coming at us if we upset the French and the Spanish, because together they can create a real problem. They could invade the home islands, which is why we don't want to send everything we have off to North America. We have to protect the channel. And of course, that does become a problem. Everything changes. The war completely changes character after 1778. And this is when all the worst fears of the First Lord come to bear, because we do not have the naval preparedness that was required to do both those things. So you had to make decisions. What are you going to do? And this really becomes the biggest criticism, I think, of Sandwich and the North Ministry, is that there is this lack of concentration of strategic thinking, and lack of concentration of force follows that. They're trying to do all of these things now in the West Indies, in India, in the East Indies, over in the Channel and off the coast of France, as well as across on the North American coast. And you just can't do that, even though you might have been the largest naval force on the planet. There is no way you can cover it all.
Hey everyone, Lee here for the Prime and Load team. We're passionate about exploring 18th century history and tactics and bringing those stories to you. But we need your help to grow our ranks. Please share this episode with a fellow history buff, leave a review where you can, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Most of all, join our email list. It gets you updates and insights into what's coming. You can join by using the link in this episode's description below. Thanks for listening, and now let's get back to the episode.
So if I could follow up for a moment, just talking about some of the more minor maritime powers, it seems to me, and Sam, we talked a little bit about this, I think, at the conference we were at in April, but it seems like there is a big difference in how the British ministry is looking at upsetting minor powers in the War of Independence era versus the 7 Years' War era. Because in the 7 Years' War era, they're stopping Swedish ships that are bringing things like rope and naval supplies to France, and sort of confiscating those naval supplies, that even like cannon that are being made in foreign countries being shipped to France. Whereas it seems like, and maybe the League of Armed Neutrality is part of this, I don't know, it seems like Britain is much less willing to interfere with the shipping of other powers in the War of Independence era. Can you speak briefly to why that would be?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think some of that has to do with this feeling that, look, this is just a small local problem for us. I mean, not local physically, but local in terms of these are British people. This is an internal fight for us, something we need to get under control now, but it's our business. I don't think that this was recognized as being the world war that it would become. And I think there was a lot of fear of that because they've just come out of a world war in the 7 Years' War. So there is appeasement going on. I think there's no better way to say it. The policies that the North Ministry is really engaging in are very appeasing to other potential powers that could come on and stand against Great Britain. And of course, the key fact here is that, and I think we know this from the 7 Years' War, the power with the most number of effective allies wins, right? That you've got to have allies. And in fact, what we see at the end of the American Revolutionary War is that Britain doesn't have any allies and it really doesn't win. It might win at sea, and there are arguments to be made that, yes, it did okay. It managed to hold on to all of its West India and East India possessions, which is a win, but losing the American colonies was not in the plan. It was not, I don't think you can call that a win. But they did understand that upsetting other sea powers to the point that you are going to create a massive alliance against you is a very dangerous thing to do. And in a way, there's so much criticism on the North administration, and so much criticism, particularly on Sandwich as First Lord of the Admiralty, but they're between a rock and a hard place in many ways. And with the problems of communication, the tyranny of distance, of trying to do this transatlantic police action becomes just something that they cannot control properly. It gets out of hand, and I don't necessarily think that they should be blamed for all of it. Some of it is just the circumstances that they find themselves in, and the fact that France says, "Yep, we're signing on," and they bring along their friends, right? That they bring the Spanish and they bring the Dutch. So, yeah, Britain's efforts at trying to keep things on an even keel in Europe don't quite work out.
I wonder, Sam, as well. I mean, it strikes me, and again, I'd really value your thoughts on this, compared with how the French Navy performs in some of the earlier wars, and indeed sort of post the French Revolution, where it's in all sorts of trouble. This is the high watermark, if you forgive the feeble pun, of French naval power in the 18th century. It seems to be not just operations, the quality of the ships, the commanders. They're a pretty formidable force, I would have said.
They are a formidable force. They have fantastic ship designs. The British are taking the drafts off of French captured ships because the designs are innovative and fast and fabulous, and the Brits want them. So this is the era in which they're doing that kind of industrial espionage, if you will, and taking the designs off. The commanders are also quite effective. De Grasse, who really doesn't come to the fore until a little bit later in the war, really shines as being someone who has, I think, a very astute understanding of his job and how to use a naval force, how to execute a good expeditionary campaign as well, when he brings all of those troops up from the West Indies to the Chesapeake to help Rochambeau and Washington to do what they do at Yorktown. I mean, they are very effective, and the battles of the American Revolutionary War are very indecisive for Britain because of the effectiveness of the French force. Now, there's an argument to be made that maybe the Spanish alliance on a naval situation might have been a little less helpful than they'd hoped. Sometimes allies are not necessarily good things, right? Because they come with baggage, they come with deals. And unless your strategic objectives are completely aligned, that might actually help lead you astray. But, I mean, look at what happens in 79. There is a real threat of an invasion of Britain coming from the combined Franco-Spanish fleet. And Britain is very, very worried about this, which is why Sandwich chooses to maintain that Western Squadron in the force that he does, which of course is an opportunity cost. It bleeds force from the east coast of the United States. So, this is the trouble when you do have allies coming together, and effective allies. Like the French fleet was very effective. Their command systems were good. Their sailors were effective. They knew their jobs. We see just how effective they are in various battles in the Caribbean, but certainly at the Battle of Virginia Capes in September of 1781. De Grasse, whose ships are undermanned because they had to kind of mobilize very, very quickly to meet this British threat from Graves and Hood. The ships are undermanned, but boy, they perform very well, and tactically and operationally, in the midst of battle, being able to fire their guns and focus on what had to be focused on. De Grasse does an incredible job.
So that's interesting. I mean, I know earlier you said the combined French and Spanish fleets do pose a real threat. I think I could almost like hear in the background a bunch of British listeners like all shouting, but quality matters more. And I'm sure that the common narrative that I'm sure you've heard is the higher skill of British seamanship is something that will carry it through. So, but it sounds like that's not as big of a factor as people might believe.
Maybe not in the Revolutionary War period. Yeah, I think, and this is what becomes the thing that British sailors will die upon, right? Is that what succeeded in the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution was rate of fire, right? We were accurate and we could just keep up that sustained rate of fire. And I mean, my gosh, this is a legacy that lives till Jutland, and probably has not very good implications for Jutland. But I think they're getting to that point during the American Revolutionary War. They're trying to learn the key elements of what it is that wins battles at sea, and they have a really mixed bag of efficacy here. I mean, most of the battles are indecisive. So being able to sort of say, oh, British superiority at sea, well, if that's the case, then even before you have your big Franco-Spanish combined fleets coming at you, then why are we looking at these indecisive battles? The Moonlight Battle in 1780 and all sorts of battles before that. Why are they so indecisive if we're that superior? And I think what we're also looking at technologically to help the British in terms of the speed and maneuverability of their ships and their efficacy in a battle is the whole technology of coppering, which is a new technology that the British are forced to adopt during the Revolutionary War, American Revolutionary War, because they need a force multiplier, right? Knowing that you've got the world's navies ranged against you, you're going to have to do something that immediately increases the effective number of ships that you have at sea at any given time. And so what do they reach for? They reach for this relatively untested new technology of coppering the bottoms of ships, knowing that it had problems. They knew, Sandwich, Middleton at the Navy Board knew that it had problems, but it doesn't matter. Whatever is going to basically give them more ships at sea at any given time, that's what we have to do. And how does it do this? Well, it keeps ships at sea longer because it stops their bottoms from becoming so fouled with barnacles and weed and all this stuff that had to be scraped off regularly. And if you were in tropical waters, well, then that stuff grew very quickly. So if the copper, which naturally sort of sheds itself in seawater, can keep the growth of all that stuff to a minimum, well, then you keep ships at sea longer and they remain faster and more maneuverable. That's a force multiplier. Now, they're also doing it to keep ships at sea because of things like shipworm, right? Shipworm will get into the hulls of a wooden ship and eat the hull literally to splinters over time. So that they had to be constantly doing refits on these timber-clad hulls. But supposedly, coppering will mean that you don't need to do that as often because the copper protects the timber. And so you can keep those ships at sea longer without having to do regular refits. But that coppering ended up being a bit of a problem. By not examining the bottoms of these coppered ships, they created effectively a whole other series of problems for themselves. But in the moment, it was exactly what was needed. and help them to start winning battles. And many of the senior commanders credit the copper ring with their ability to win in these fights.
If we could just rewind slightly on the battle side of it, Sam. I mean, it strikes me one of the other things we think of the line of battle, particularly in this era, and linear tactics, which I think has been argued ties to the indecision, and that breaking the line and going for it in a bit more of an aggressive fashion, as Hawke had done in earlier wars, and Nelson, of course, would very famously do later on. I mean, is that a fair comment on naval warfare in the 70s and 80s? And perhaps you could sort of expand on naval tactics a little bit more generally in terms of fleet actions?
Sure. In the Revolutionary War, I think we are looking very much at the line of battle actions. I mean, most of the big ones that you can think of at least start out that way. Virginia Cape starts out that way. Attacks at Ushant start out that way, which is, again, another one of those indecisive battles, right? Battle of Ushant. The Battle of the Saints, everyone's going for that line of battle tactic. But of course, at the Saints, Rodney breaks the line because he's able to get the weather gauge. He's able to take advantage of some pretty crazy weather systems that are messing up the formations of the French fleet. Yes, that is very much the way things are done, right? Battle of Virginia Capes is classic, where they line up and they try to shoot at each other. Now there are problems with engaging in the rear of the British can't engage in the rear of that battle, but that's what they're going for. That's what the attempt is. I think really that changes when you get to Nelson, who very much is like, look, we can attempt to do this. This will be the plan, but no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy, right? I know that's anachronistic to Nelson, but whatever, right? It's still true. And then what do? We just go for it, like melee battle. Bring about whatever we can, whatever damage we can do on the enemy in whatever circumstances we can do. That's what we need to do. And I think that embrace of the idea of melee tactics, of no man can do very wrong if he puts his ship beside the enemy and fires. That kind of idea is something that evolves going into the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. We are definitely in that period of learning how to engage at sea, learning what the best way to do things is. There's still a lot of very rigid, structured mindset, though, in the American Revolution. And we see that even in the engagements that happen in the earlier part of the war under Lord Howe, right? The way that the Navy operates is very structured and very formal when it's at going into the Chesapeake Bay, heading up towards Philadelphia, when it's at Newport, Rhode Island. These are very limited creatively in how they're using the force that they have, I think.
Is there such a thing as a typical battle? I mean, you mentioned Virginia Capes a couple of times now. I don't know if that would qualify, or whether there are others that maybe exemplify the warfare of this era.
Yeah, I mean, Virginia Capes is a good one because there are so many rules that have to be followed I'll speak about the British side of it rather than just the French side. The British idea is that we come in this line of battle, and typically what they should have done is when they approach the coast, as they're coming in on this roughly track from the northeast, is they should have turned in succession, where one ship, turned at an imaginary line in the ocean, and then every other ship hit that imaginary line in the ocean and made the same turn, so that they all end up in this line of battle formation where the strongest ships were in the van, right? You wanted your most powerful, your fastest, your best crews in the lead of that squadron that was going to come into first contact with the enemy, who was also in a line of battle. However, that is not what Graves, the commander on station, instructs. He says, as they're coming in towards the coastline from the northeast, he tells everyone to basically wear in succession. To wear simultaneously. Apologies. So what this means is that basically now the ships that were in the van in the lead are now going to be at the rear of the column. And the ships that were at the end, the slowest and the worst quality vessels, are now going to be in the lead. So by not following the strict forms of what you should have done, because he saw weather changes and he saw certain things that didn't materialize the way he'd planned on them, he ends up creating a situation where the strongest ships in de Grasse's formation are going to go up against the weakest ships in the British formation. And that's bad. Okay, that does not end well for those vessels. And de Grasse, of course, is really good at spotting weather changes in this battle. So being able to read the wind, being able to understand how the vessels are going to come together when they do actually line up. It's very formulaic. So, and it's all happening in slow motion, of course. That's the key weird thing that I think it's really hard for us to envision, that all of this is happening at a rate of about 2 or 3 miles an hour.
So just to sort of follow up, say if we're describing like an archetypical naval battle, how British naval officers were thinking about combat, are the two lines of the opposing fleets, say that the French on the one side, the British on the other, are they going in the same direction and they're sort of slowly getting closer to each other? Are they passing by each other? Like, are there different strategies for engaging in each of those situations? Like how do you actually approach the enemy in one of these battles?
Yeah, it's a good question, and the answer is a very historical one. Historians love to equivocate. It depends. Right? It depends on a lot of things. It depends on the wind, because you have very limited maneuverability. You can only, I think the closest these vessels can sail to the wind is like 16 points off the wind, right? So it's not like a modern sailing ship where you have maneuverability to go wherever you want. The wind has to be coming from behind. So that's going to dictate, how you have to approach the enemy. I guess the ideal would be that you're both traveling in opposite directions. Okay, so someone's coming. So a port side would meet a starboard side broadside. Okay, and that's how that'll work. But in the case of Virginia Capes, they were actually both traveling in the same direction. So that's a different one. And then, of course, at the Battle of the Saints in 1782, Rodney breaks the line. So he's able to use the weather gauge, the wind advantage, come in and split the French squadron into pieces and bring about a melee battle. Like, he's able to get up on the inside of them. You use the wind in any way you can, because that is the main dictating force that will determine how you can attack. And when they pass each other at musket shot distance sometimes, but the Virginia Capes was those ships of the van on both sides that engaged were, the French said, at half a musket shot. The British said at musket shot. So we're talking between 50 and 100 yards, roughly. Okay, they're really close, and they are pounding the living daylights out of each other with those big, 18 and 24 pounder shot. So it truly is something that's hard to picture in your head, just the levels of destruction that would have taken place at that close range. Because, of course, the big killer here is splinters. It's not necessarily cannonball or grape shot. That's really designed to wreck the spars and the yards and the sails and the lines and all of that sort of stuff. The thing that killed men was splinters, because you put a 24-pound ball right through the hull of a wooden warship, and that's going to create man-sized splinters that are going to take you down. So it's very easy to be critical of these commanders and they did this wrong and they should have done this, and lousy command decisions. But in the thick of what that actually looked like and what that meant on the gun deck of a wooden warship, my goodness, that is a whole different level of terror, I think, and something we don't think about enough.
Yeah, you see that in warfare on land as well. I think an important development in the level of engagement with military history is moving beyond. Oh man, he was so dumb. If I had been there, I would have done it right. And so often you see that with undergraduate students, and the hope is maybe they'll engage with it at a more serious level. But that's great.
Absolutely.
I mean, I was just going to say, it struck me as what you were saying. The firepower on even a single one of these ships is a greater weight of shot than probably all the artillery on the field at Minden or Hohenfreiberg or whichever land battle we might care to choose. I mean, you've given us a picture of horror already, but I mean, did you want to say any more about the human experience of being on the receiving end, or indeed the dishing out end of all that firepower?
Sure. I mean, it's it's a dangerous life on board, and one of the things I've worked on a fair bit is boys. Okay, the children who were on board these warships, and that's true of whether it was a French ship or a Spanish ship or a British ship. There were always children, and a lot of them. And you have children there who are studying, learning to be officers. You have children who are the powder monkeys, right? The lower deck boys who are learning to be sailors. But everyone's involved in this battle, and everyone's is in danger. Life and limb is at risk just about everywhere on these ships. And one of the talking specifically about the damage that can be done on the gun decks of these vessels in battle. Years ago, I had to work on a show in Britain where they were looking at graves, mass graves from Haslar, from the Portsmouth Naval Graveyard. And one of the sets of bones they brought up was, and these are all unidentified people, they're unmarked graves. One of the sets of bones they brought up was from a child, and they estimated that this child was probably around 12 years old, 10 to 12 years old, and that they had a shattered leg that was just decimated. The bone had just been ripped to pieces, and had also shown signs of amputation, but not a very good amputation. Journals of captains from this time are beyond imagination. I mean, there's a famous one that comes from the French Revolutionary War, where you have a captain talking about being in a battle, and the person standing right beside them had their head taken off, was decapitated by a cannonball, and that they turned to the aide next door, their servant who was standing next to them, and said, "Bring me an orange." And this was meant to be an example of British sang-froid, right? Just cool as a cucumber in the midst of a battle. Someone's decapitated next to you and you ask for an orange. And the whole idea here is that, well, why do you ask for an orange? Well, probably because he was physically sick and needed to clear the taste from his mouth. It's just, I mean, yeah, you can read these documents in different ways. And then, of course, there's just the danger of being in the proximity of a cannonball that is flying by. It doesn't actually have to hit you to kill you, right? I mean, the force, the vacuum that is created by the movement of something so enormous in close proximity to a human body is going to create enormous internal hemorrhage and kill you. Yeah, it's bonkers. It's just insane to think about. And then there's the small arms fire on top of that, because of course when you engage at close range, both sides have got men up in the fighting tops that are raining all sorts of shot down upon you from above. And indeed, that's what killed Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar. There is danger everywhere.
Yeah, you see those same descriptions on land. Like, if a cannonball passes close to your head, you're going to die. It doesn't have to hit you. I mean, the concussive force can cause brain trauma and things like that. I guess so. I want to ask a real fast follow-up question that's almost like a trivia. I don't know. Have you ever been to see the U.S. brig Niagara? It's a War of 1812 era ship that is up in Erie, Pennsylvania, which is not on really, I guess. It's relatively close to where Lee and I live, but it's not, right, on anybody's way to anything, I guess. Um, they have an incredible museum where they have a rebuilt brig from the War of 1812, which is an incredible experience. You can sail on it, you can sort of take a tour of it. But on the other side of things, the U.S. military, I think in the 90s, built a false side of a brig and took it out to a massive gunnery range, like one of our artillery gunnery range, and fired like 24-pound shot into the side of this brig with cameras. And so they have this sort of playing on loop. You can see the splinters that are generated sort of by this, the shot impacting the side of the vessel. I mean, if you ever find yourself in the Northeast, say the CRE is ever up in, Buffalo or something, take some time and go to this museum. It's absolutely incredible. And the Niagara is also just a wonderful sort of ship to see.
You make me feel really bad. I was up there for NASO last year, and I did all of the battlefields, but I didn't make it down to Erie. We covered as much as we could, but I didn't get down there. So I'm just going to have to come back because I would love to see that.
Yeah, come up to Pittsburgh sometime. We'll go up to Erie and see the museum. It's really incredible. My folks live about a half hour away, so I'm up there all the time, which is why I've come across it. Yeah.
So we started talking kind of about the people on the ship, and oftentimes, well, in other episodes, we've talked about kind of the tactical makeup of different units, and we're talking about naval warfare in terms of ships sailing in different places. Obviously, there are men aboard these ships, and there's got to be some sort of organization, tactical and administrative organization. Can you kind of go through that a little bit?
Sure. On board the ship, I mean, we're working with a divisional system, okay, during this point. So the men, well, let me back up a little bit. So on board, you're going to have, in terms of the lower deck men, you've got your able seamen, who are your most qualified sailors. You've got ordinary seamen who are on their way to being these experts. Then you usually have landsmen or wasters, wasters because they existed in the waist of the ship, not because they're a waste of space, although some of the able seamen might have thought that. And so you're going to have a spread of those guys in each of the divisions that are going to be working at any given time. The most qualified men are going to also be topmen, meaning that they go up the rigging and have to do all that really technical work of furling and unfurling sails at these extreme heights under incredibly difficult conditions. You're either in storms or in a battle, and you're having to deal with sails and things like that. It's no easy thing. And I have sailed on tall ships. I have done years of sail training. I've never been comfortable climbing that rigging, but I've made myself do it so that I know what I'm talking about. It's very scary. And I was not under fire. So yeah. And then for the leadership in terms of the officer structure, you got all of your quarterdeck officers, you got your captain, obviously, and your senior lieutenants, and then you've got all your petty officers that are kind of running the deck as well. So everyone has to work together. I mean, on a 74-gun ship, you have, which is sort of your average ship of the line, you're going to have 600-700 men who have to figure out how to work together. Now, they will be on watches, okay? So you'll be divided up into watches, and then in terms of that, you're divided up into divisions. But when it's battle stations, it is all hands on deck. So trying to create a coordinated system where everyone knows what gun they're working, everyone knows which line they're pulling, everyone knows where they are on sail management and steering and all of that good stuff. It has to be a finely tuned machine. And it takes time to get a crew trained to that level. And the British were very good at that. I mean, captains understood that getting their crews into fighting order was essential. And so having those lieutenants who were able to manage the divisions, and then the midshipmen below them who were sort of the next in line to keep the men under control. Everyone had their task, and boy, the structure of that ship had to be tight. It had to be brutally enforced structural hierarchies, okay? But discipline was what it was all about. The discipline of the ship. And in fact, there are a lot of documents that I've read over the years of looking at memoirs and looking at journals and things like that. And what I've sort of come to the understanding is that good sailors, good seamen, wanted a tight ship. They did not mind a captain who could be brutal, who could be harsh, because it kept everyone else in line. It kept the machine working and functioning as it should. And ultimately, it saved lives, because keeping that sort of, the whole kind of rum sodomy and the lash thing, it's like the lash being the operative part of that. Yes, of course. But I think a lot of sailors actually said, okay, I will accept that, because that's what's going to keep this little wooden world functioning and alive. And it's going to keep me alive to, continue my brutal life. But yeah, I mean, it's not an easy life. And that's why kids started young. I mean, whether they were powder monkeys or whether they were quarterdeck boys, they started young because the idea was they had to become accustomed to this difficult life from an early point. Otherwise, you weren't going to survive it. You had to understand how it worked, why it worked, in order to survive.
So if I could kind of follow up there, maybe transition into the second set of questions we're going to look at today. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of power structures and relationships between these relatively young officers, the midshipmen, and the sort of the older sailors? I mean, in the 18th century world of land warfare, and then to some extent even in the military today, you see kind of questions and jokes about how a very young second lieutenant is going to go in and command and be over enlisted men and non-commissioned officers who have been in the military for 20 or 30 years. Is there a similar relationship in the Georgian Navy where you have these 12, 13 years? I don't know how old a midshipman is, a very young midshipman who is commanding men who have been in the Navy for 30 years? Is that ever commented on? Do you see that power structure addressed at all?
Yes. Yes. And I think maybe your question is getting to, is it like commented on as being unusual or weird or, not functional? And generally not. Okay. I mean, it's an accepted part of life in the 18th century and the early 19th century too. It is a very bizarre thing, right, to see, and the stuff I've worked on involves young midshipmen, and on average, mids are 12, 13 years old, but often they started a lot younger than that. I mean, gosh, the youngest I found was 5. It was 5. But the idea of having boys in these command positions where they have technically authority over and above 30-year veteran sailors on board the ship, that was not seen as something out of the ordinary or unusual or bizarre. Now, sometimes if it was in a command position, say they're in a battle and bad orders are given, well, generally the sailors are going to compensate for that lack of experience and that lack of understanding of a tactical situation. But if a midshipman wanted to be a pill about it and to, accuse a sailor of not following orders, then that would have to be followed up on, because technically they were there with the authority of the captain behind them and their orders had to be followed. Now, that's the letter of the law, but in practicality, we see a lot of these mids actually being taken under the wing of the old sailors. The old sailors will help to teach them literally learn the ropes, right? That's what they're there to do. And any midshipman who has half a brain understands that they have to know this stuff, and therefore they better listen. And I guess this is the big difference between the Army and the Navy at this time. Army, you can buy a commission, right? Army, you can be some aristocratic idiot, upper class twit, right? And you can buy whatever commission level you want. You can be a lieutenant in the Army, you can be a colonel if you want to, right? All you have to do is get on a horse, hold a gun and command men forward, You can't do that in the Navy. And this is the big difference, right? You have to have skills, you have to have knowledge, you have to have the ability to not just command, but also to do the job. So the first job of these young kids when they go on board is to learn to reef, knot, and splice, right? They have to be sailors first. And one of the big differences too in the Navy is that you have to pass a qualifying examination for a lieutenant. To become a lieutenant, you had to have at least 6 years in a rating of midshipman or master's mate, which meant you had to have 6 years of apprenticeship, basically, before you could become a commissioned officer. And that has good implications for the Navy in that it means you have to generally be qualified before you can become a captain. Now, during the 7 Years' War, during the American Revolutionary War, you still have cases where you get people qualifying for lieutenant and even captain who shouldn't be there, okay? Because the patronage and the connections mean more. But by the French Revolutionary War, and certainly by the Napoleonic Wars, that's not the case. You might be aristocratic, but you have to have the chops too, because you can't do your job, and you have to do your job. You've got to pass this qualifying examination. Now, does that bring up problems within the Navy? Feeling as the less than service to the Army sometimes? Because the Army would hold it over the Navy that you guys are just, a bunch of professionals. Ugh. I know it's a weird thing, right?
Yeah, horrible. Would hate to have that.
Yeah, well, think about it, right? In the 18th century, professionals worked for a living, right? Professionalism was kind of a little bit despised, because the real leaders of society are hereditary aristocrats, or at the very least gentry, and they don't work. They are amateurs. So amateurism is prized in this time. And professionalism is kind of a little bit less than. So because the Navy, even if you're going to become an officer, even if you're the son of a lord who's going to inherit that title, you are, an heir, it doesn't matter. You still have to qualify. And it kind of makes the Navy a little bit more professional and a little bit more, That's why more aristocrats go into the Army, because they don't have to pass qualifying exams. They can just go in and be the natural leaders that they are. And yeah, it's an interesting conundrum. It's so counterintuitive to what we think of today. But to be a good leader back in the 18th and 19th century, you just had to be born well. That was generally the consensus.
I'm glad to be safely on land where we don't have any bourgeois men running things. But tell me, are there, so obviously, as you've just described, across many 18th century armies, there is, at least theoretically in peacetime, a class barrier. You've got to have Von or D in front of your name if you're going to be an officer. In the Navy, do they just let, son of a carpenter, he can go qualify for lieutenant after 6 years? If there's no class requirement at all, this is scandalous.
Yeah, well, okay. Let me just put the qualifier on this. That's what it's supposed to be, right? And I think today, like when you have conversations in front of the general public in Britain today, they love to hear the idea that the Navy was a meritocracy. Right? Then because of these qualifying exams, because we weeded out the upper class twit chaff, right? that the Navy was a true meritocracy and yay us. That's not true. Okay. It is more true in the early part of the 18th century. Okay. Sort of coming through all of the wars of Austrian succession and blah, blah, blah. And, and getting us up to, say, the American Revolution, you could rise on merit. And we do have people going from the lower deck, rising up on their own merits of their own bootstraps and becoming commissioned officers. Okay. Increasingly, that's becoming more and more difficult. And that's what I found in my research, particularly, is that through the French Revolutionary Wars, also, yes, we have examples of lower deck men qualifying for commissioned officer status. By the time we get to the post-Trafalgar world, that is not really happening. Okay. What Nelson effectively does is make the Navy sexy. Right. Lots of young kids are wanting to join the Navy because they want to be just like Nelson. And so now more aristocratic children are choosing a naval career over an army career. And so what that meant was the opportunities are narrowing and narrowing for people to be able to raise up from the lower deck. And increasingly, what happens over the course of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and certainly into the years after the Napoleonic Wars, into the decades up to political reform in 1832, is that the Navy's becoming increasingly aristocratic in its officer corps, right? Because there's just not that many opportunities. And after 1815, of course, the demobilizations, well, they make it really tough for anyone without a title, or at least anyone who's extremely well connected politically, to get an officer's position, even a junior officer's position in the Navy. So, yeah. So meritocracy, sort of, up to a point.
So, and this is fascinating. Okay, so first of all, please don't blah 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 the War of Austrian Succession. Second, you've just given a story where it's not just kind of a straight line of progress. We're getting more and more sort of meritocratic as time goes on, which I think is wonderful, right? It's so key to see that our common narratives of early modern into modern and sort of progress, things like this don't always work out in practice. Turning to the world of technology, you've already talked to a bit of us about copper bottoming, so I won't have you rehash all that. But can you just tell us? You've explained the ways why it was great. You explained the ways why it was sort of what the Navy reached for in the environment of the War of Independence. But what were the drawbacks? You kind of hinted at that near the end. Maybe this was going to cause some long-term problems. How did this technological solution also create new headaches for the British Navy?
Yeah, a lot of headaches, boy. And they were aware there were problems, but I think it's implemented just because there's so much compression and so much pressure to get more ships at sea for longer. Big problems are, number one, the sheathing is only effective where it remains on the hull. So in order to keep the worms out, the shipworm out, Teredo nivalis, you've got to keep that thing solid and tight, right? It's Roger Knight described it as a link in the chain. You've got to keep all those links solid and functioning if the whole thing is going to function. Because anywhere those worms could get into the hull, like at a place where maybe the anchor had knocked a piece of the copper sheathing off or worn it through or something like that, then that whole section was completely vulnerable and the worms could burrow in through there and then just continue their journey through the rest of the hull. And of course, all of that would then be masked by the fact that the copper sheathing was there. So you couldn't see the damage. And in fact, we see big problems coming, which I'll talk about in a second. The other problem was that, and they didn't understand how this worked, but they understood it was a problem. Copper sheathing in close proximity to the iron bolts that hold ships together, the iron bolts, the iron rudder pintles, all the iron fittings that basically held the ship with one plank attached to the next, the presence of copper created galvanic action, electrolytic action in seawater. So what it ended up doing was whittling those iron bolts. And we have evidence, we have documents that are printed to this effect, that an iron bolt that is 1.25 inches in diameter within a matter of about 6 to 9 months was whittled down to the size of a quill. So this dual situation of where you've got worms burrowing in underneath the copper so you can't see it, and the fact that the copper is electrolytically degrading the iron bolts and fittings, this is creating ships that fall apart if you poke them too hard. Okay, and so the Sandwich, Lord Sandwich, First Lord of the Admiralty, orders that all of the ships of the Navy are to be coppered in 1779. Okay, so that they're ready, and they do this very quickly. So they have to take those ships off the line, take the time to put the copper on. But now they might be able to stay at sea for 3 years without being refitted, whereas before they were coming in between 6 months and 14 months for a refit, right? So now they're staying at sea for 3 years, but the worms are doing their work, the electrolysis is doing its work, and so by 1782, things are literally starting to fall apart. Actually, the first instance that we really see of this is at the Battle of Virginia Capes in September of 1781. HMS Terrible, which ends up as one of these ships that's come up from the West Indies. She's in pretty bad shape. She's shipping a lot of water before the battle. One of the documents I found said that she was shipping 6 feet of water in the hold every couple of hours, which is a lot. That had to be pumped out before the battle. So here she goes into the battle, and just the firing of her guns, which is enough to, really shake up all of the framing and the timbers, rendered her useless at the end of the battle. It wasn't the battle that killed her. It was the fact that she was so rotten from those two things that she couldn't hold together. Even when she fired her guns, they had to scuttle the ship at the end of the battle. So Terrible lived up to her name. Again, in 1782, after the Battle of the Saints, it's September, so it's a few months after the Saints, and Graves, who was in command at Virginia Capes, is going to have a double whammy here. He now has to escort a whole bunch of merchantmen across from Jamaica back to England. He's also got all the prizes from the Battle of the Saints, including Ville de Paris. They start their journey, they hit a hurricane. A lot of the ships that he's in company with are in such bad shape, they literally fall apart when this hurricane hits. 3,500 men die in that hurricane because their ships can't handle it. 1782, the Royal George at anchor in Spithead, while she's being heeled over, she's sort of been careened at anchor for some repairs, literally falls apart. Now, there were problems in how she was careened, and they didn't move guns, and careening is sort of when you lean the ship over, you draw it down so that you can work on the upper part of the hull. There were problems with that in that they didn't move the guns where they should have, and there were all these civilians coming on board, loading stores at the same time. But the court of inquiry that comes afterwards, the court martial that comes for the loss of the ship, basically finds that the reason the ship sank at anchor, capsized at anchor, was because the structure failed, that the carpenters and other senior petty officers reported that they heard these huge cracks and that the whole ship essentially imploded on itself under these pressures and fell apart. And they attributed that to rotten boards from shipworm and the fact that her iron fittings couldn't hold it together anymore. So Britain was really lucky that the war ended when it did, so that it didn't have to keep all these ships at sea for much longer, because they probably would have been a lot more failures like this. And captains are starting to really report that the copper is a problem. So the solution, I guess, is the next thing. And of course, Sandwich is not an idiot. He knew this was a problem. As soon as he ordered the ships coppered, he's already starting to work on solutions as well. And so by the time, he's already been kicked out of the government in 1782. By the time Keppel, who's the next Lord of the Admiralty, has to make decisions about this, he's got a solution, which is brass. It's a copper and zinc alloy that they figure out, well, okay, we're going to have to refit all the ships with this alloy that's not going to have electrolytic effects. And that's what they do basically between the end of the Revolutionary War, American Revolutionary War, and the start of the French Revolutionary War, so that Britain has a very effective copper bottomed and copper alloy fastened fleet by the time they go into the new French wars. And that's why they're so effective, because they iron out all these problems at the end of the American Revolution.
So to some extent, in the War of Independence after 1779, it's almost kind of like you have Schrodinger's hull. Like if the copper bottoming is working, the hull could be great, but you can't really see that if it's working or not. And so you don't really know you have a problem until there's a catastrophic failure.
Right.
Okay.
Although they knew they had a problem.
Okay.
I mean, they knew the powers that be who are deciding this, they knew there was a problem, which is why they started working on it, on the solution immediately. But they didn't have a choice. You know, it was a strategic necessity to keep these ships, and the whole thing stems back to the fact that at the start of the American Revolutionary War, Sandwich was not in a position at the Admiralty. He didn't have the power at the Admiralty to say, we need full mobilization right now, and we need massive shipbuilding right now, because we need to build a bigger, better fleet. He was politically fairly weak at the start of the war. So Germain, who controls the land war, is able to dominate and say, no, this is what we're going to do. It's a police action. Navy, you're just playing a supporting role here. All you have to do is get us there and provide the transportation that's going to supply my army. That's not what turned out to be, of course, because when it becomes a world war, we need that Navy. And we are so behind the eight ball. You know, there's a famous quote from Command of the Ocean, should get that right? From Nicholas Roger, where he basically says, this is the moment at which Britain was at the greatest risk of losing everything, ever, is in 1778, 1779. You know, it's a really serious situation. So Sandwich didn't have much of a choice.
Just picking up, Sam, on that point you were making about Sandwich and what was needed, and this is perhaps really something we ought to have asked earlier on, but you've alluded to a little bit, but perhaps you could say a little bit more about the mechanics of how, not so much the Navy was organised, but how it was administered. I mean, thinking about the shipbuilding, the manning, the victualling, all that side of it. You know, we think of the press gang when it comes to manning, which is probably a horrible misrepresentation, but perhaps you could say something about some of that.
Sure. I mean, the administration is really something that has been built up for hundreds of years at this point, right? And this is the extraordinary thing. Like, you can create an army pretty quickly, right? You can create an army. You need some unemployed aristocrats. you need a few horses, and then you need a bunch of guys, and you need some guns. Okay, so you can create an army, right? But in order
I'm so offended right now.
Sorry, guys. I know you are. You know, I have to poke at the army when I can, right?
That's right.
Low hanging fruit, right? But the construction of a navy is something that requires hundreds of years to be able to really mobilize something that's functional. I mean, and going back to the Henrician period, I mean, this is started then. The idea that we're setting up these massive systems for the construction of warships, or at least contractor systems, because of course Britain is involving contractors in the construction of warships all the time throughout its history. Then you have to figure out how to feed them. It's not the same as feeding an army, where you're engaged in land warfare. Therefore, you can either go and pillage what you need, or you can buy what you need if you have magazine systems. That's fine. Here, you can't do that. You have to have everything prepared fully in barrels that's salted, that can be, last for years on board the ship. You have to bake the biscuit. You have to create an infrastructure that is enormous and expensive and requires constant maintenance, right? And I think that's the extraordinary thing that Britain does, because of course all of these countries Britain and Spain and Sweden and Portugal and Holland, they all engage in sea power. But being able to commit to the sustaining value of that is really the thing. And that requires not just a navy or even a functional or robust merchant fleet, but it requires a government being behind it, because that money, the sinews of war, is really where it's all at. Like, all of that has to be provided by the government. So the government has to be fully on board, and not just for the period of a war. It has to be fully on board forever if it's going to really be functional. But that said, I would argue that it's a lot more haphazard. Like, it sounds very structured. It sounds very much like the government is directing everything and keeping it all on track and orchestrating this whole symphony of naval and sea power together. And it's not that. It's very much more organic, I think, than that, because industries are going to rise up and see that there is an opportunity to make money here. So that becomes a private industry that then gets a government contract that gloms on to do this particular service for the Navy and make it functional. So it's something that takes a long time to build, and it has to have constant reinforcement in order to sustain it. All right, so in terms of manpower, press gangs they're awful. I mean, there's nothing to be said, right? I mean, they're terrible. Now, the whole point of the press gang was not to just go and clobber any old Joe over the head and get him drunk and Shanghai him onto a boat. I mean, the point was to go after knowledgeable seamen, people who lived on the water. You had to be a waterman to be press ganged, technically. Now, as manning becomes a real issue, and boy, does it become an issue by the time we get into the French wars, because you got the army, going after the same pool of guys. You got the merchant fleets who are also attracting seamen, and then you got the Navy. Everyone's trying to do everything all at once, and they're all growing all at once. So it's very problematic, and press ganging becomes a little bit more indiscriminate. But I think one of the key things to think about, and that there's real historical debates here about just how much the press gang influenced and how much press men made up naval manning during this time. And I think it's been overstated. I mean, I think that the work that's been done by Jay Dancy in The Myth of the Press Gang has really sort of opened a lot of eyes to the fact that I think we've latched onto this because it is a true horror, right? And it is just indicative of that brutal aspect of the Navy that we love to focus on, with all the flogging and the horrible treatment of our sailors. But it probably has become a little bit romanticized in a negative way, that really should probably be a little bit corrected. Most of the people who came on board were volunteers. Now, volunteers who, took the king's shilling, essentially. They came on board for the bounties, but most of them were volunteers.
Yeah. Same is true on land. Yeah, conscription and things like this are frequently overblown. Kind of on that note, as compared to a career in the merchant fleet, is there anything that would be attractive about the Navy? I mean, if you're an able seaman on a merchant ship, is there something that you would say, well, I'll go serve on a warship instead?
Yeah. Most sailors are probably going to be more interested in serving in a merchant ship if they can. However, I'll qualify that in a minute. Now, merchant ships had the advantage of paying more. Okay, you got better pay. You sometimes had better conditions on board, not always. But also you probably didn't have the threat of heavy corporal or perhaps capital punishment hanging over your head for doing something wrong. Okay. That said, the Navy was an attractive option for a lot of people at the time. We tend to think about food security as being just, well, of course there's food security. It's not something we generally think about. In Britain in the 18th century, just because you were alive in Britain did not mean you were going to not starve to death. And especially young men, young people who can't find work. The Industrial Revolution's going on. They've lost their farm jobs. They can't find work in the factories. The Navy is a viable option, especially for young boys in orphanages or poor houses. Come into the Navy, you get 3 squares a day, right? And you're always going to have enough food. Now, quality is a different thing, but quantity is always there, just about. But you're going to learn a profession as well. You're going to learn a profession that will carry you through the rest of your working life. And that in itself bred a kind of, pride, professional pride among many naval sailors. And that's why you have many men on board ships throughout this period who are career Navy sailors. And once you get used to that harsh life, once you understand the disciplinary action, you accept it. And you're like, this is me, this is who I am, this is my identity. And there's been work done too. Roland Piche had years ago talked about the sense of this sailor's identity, which you really saw when they came ashore. They dressed in different clothes. They wore the short clothes of the Navy. They had their lingo, their jargon that they spoke in. And this was performed when they went ashore as a point of pride for being Navy sailors,
Thank you very much, Sam, for coming on. We really appreciated that. This was incredible. Hopefully we can do another one where we maybe dive into some other topics a little bit more specifically at some point. But thank you so much. This was fantastic.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with a link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date on the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, formerly known as X. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Artie Sun, and Adrian Berenegger. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.